Christine. It's great. Thanks for everyone for coming out tonight too. It's great to see so many friends and new faces. So we're gonna talk a little bit.
We're gonna wing it.
We're gonna wing it, but we've warmed up a little. So maybe I should just say why I invited Martha to come and speak with me. And there's two reasons. One is that Martha actually knew Chauncey and taught him for a semester at the San Francisco Art Institute. So, and I interviewed Martha when I was writing the book. But I think the other, maybe the more important reason is that Martha has created a significant body of work and writing about the question of documentary photography, its politics, and its relation to art and aesthetics. And I think that is the question I want to talk most about in relation to Chauncey Hare's work, because I think it really is fundamental to his photography. But you asked me right before we got on stage. You said the question you wanted to ask me was, why would I want to write a book on Chauncey Hare? Maybe you should say why, with that inflection.
I'm Chauncey.
Brooklyn, why Chauncey?
Well, the answer in some ways is very specific and personal. It's that in 2009, when Steidl published Protest Photographs, which was a kind of anthology of his work, and I should say my friend Frank Heath, who's in the audience, was the one who showed me that book and said, you should take a look at this. And at first I was immediately captivated by the images, the photographs. It struck me. I mean, in some ways they look like this. This is not a typical Chauncey Hare photograph, but in some ways maybe it's a paradigmatic Chauncey Hare photograph. This is a self-portrait of him when he was working at the EPA in 1980. And I feel at this moment I have to advance the slide and add the caption that Chauncey Hare exists. It requires that it's presented when any of his work is published in any form, which says, this photograph is made by Chauncey Hare to protest and warn against the growing domination of working people by multinational corporations and their elite owners and managers. And I have to say, when I saw that in the Steidl book, plus the images, I was kind of sold in some ways. I thought, this is pretty interesting. And it was, I think, it was then reading his biography and learning about this person who worked for 20 years as a chemical engineer at Standard Oil. He graduates from Columbia in 1956 with a degree in chemistry. He gets a job in Richmond, California on the East Bay, working at Standard Oil. And the job makes him ill. And he takes up photography as a kind of pastime, as a kind of therapeutic pastime, and begins to receive regional success, having shows in Oakland, in San Francisco, and through his regional success, is introduced to John Sarkowski, the curator at the Museum of Modern Art, who supports him. I think writes a letter of recommendation for a Guggenheim Fellowship, which he receives in 1969, which allows him to take a year off of work, like a sabbatical. And at that moment, I don't know should I just tell the whole story, or should we? Sure. Okay, I can do it in 5 minutes. But it's because it was the power of the photographs, and I mean, why would I write? I mean, the other question is, why would I write a biography? I'm an art historian, and biography is kind of recherche, but the life story was so fascinating. So here's this guy who is a chemical engineer who gets a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he spends the year taking photographs of people in their houses, mainly. Not entirely, but mostly for photographs of people in their houses. Maybe I'll just show one characteristic photograph, and the crucial photograph in many ways. This was actually a Standard Oil employee named Orville England that Chauncey encountered one day, and this was kind of the crucial photograph that led him off on this project that then leads to photographs like this, taken also in Richmond, California, where he's using, maybe just to point out some of the kind of characteristic Harean pictorial strategies, a wide-angle lens on a large format camera with a flash. And the wide-angle lens often brings in these kind of marginal details, like the cat food box that he says the subjects of his photographs often don't know are being included. So there's this kind of duplicity that occurs. And then this kind of just very intense light caused by the flash. And that's something you see in a lot of Hare's work, and also the kind of spatial expansion caused by the wide-angle lens. Those are, at least pictorially, what characterizes Hare's work. He gets another Guggenheim in 1971, which allows him to take another year off of work, and this time he travels to the Ohio River Valley, where his family is from. He was born in Niagara Falls, New York, and photographs people in the Ohio River Valley. These are just, again, two characteristic and wonderful photographs from that series. The phone cord. I mean, when Martha and I were talking a few days ago in preparation for our conversation, you said how everyone's caged, and this becomes even more explicit in the next body of work he does. But the phone cord is like the stanchion. And again, this is in some ways an effect of the wide-angle lens that really kind of pushes everyone almost centrifugally to the edges of the photograph. In the other photograph, you have the two figures on either end, and then the way that this wallpaper meets in the corner almost like anamorphically distorts. And so you get this strange, surreal space. And I don't know if you can all see this, but repeatedly Hare identifies these animals, the horses on the wall, and then there's these kind of horse tchotchkes. Often they're caged birds, all of which seem to kind of make this idea of confinement just so powerful. Anyhow, gets a third Guggenheim in 1976. At the time, he's only the third photographer to get 3 Guggenheims: Walker Evans, Ansel Adams, and Chauncey Hare. It's kind of a remarkable fact.
Wow.
I mean, this is what I mean when you think this life is remarkable. Throughout this time, he is in dialogue and correspondence with John Sarkowski about having a show at MoMA. He's somewhat reluctant to do this, but ultimately agrees. For his third Guggenheim, he initially thinks he's going to go down to Mississippi and continue this sort of project and really continue in the tradition of the FSA photographers that he admired, like Russell Lee and Walker Evans.
I was thinking about that. It's actually more like Margaret Bourke-White, with the light array and the kind of like blasting and the kind of theatricalization that's really quite different. I mean, I believe you that, well, we know he was looking at the FSA, but his actual tactics really are much more from the commercial world.
Yeah, I mean, that's something he would probably not admit. I think you're, in terms of just the way they look, though. Yeah, they're more theatrical than anything that Evans would have ever made. That's right. Yes, I think your point's right.
He desentimentalizes in about 1 million different ways, and although it's a little bit, I'm not going to say, Evans got pegged as an aristocrat for the kind of coolness and detachment, whatever, so I wouldn't call it sentimental. But it certainly isn't theatricalized in the same way that this kind of lighting approach and also the wide angle and the spatial distortion.
And I would just say there's a humanism in his work that's in Hare's work.
Is that what you call
Well, his interest in people, which is different. Well, I don't know. I think it's kind of sentimental in some ways. I mean, there's a pathos.
It depends on whom.
Yeah, I mean,
It depends on whom. I think if you look at the photos from Standard Oil.
yeah. Well, let's get there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
But do these have captions?
Just the name of the city. So this is something like Westchester, Pennsylvania. He doesn't give any titles beyond the date and the city where they're taken. So for his third Guggenheim, he ultimately, this is kind of the crucial moment in his life where he gets politicized. He decides, instead of continuing this sort of FSA project of photographing people in their houses, and we could say maybe even more about the process of how he goes about doing that, because that's fascinating. How do you get into somebody's house when you're Chauncey Hare and not Ansel Adams or Walker Evans, right?
By knocking on the door?
Yes, but it takes more than that. Hare would write governors and go to police stations and newspapers, offices in each city, and get kind of credentials. And he would often, somewhat duplicitous credentials, saying that he was working for the Library of Congress for a kind of survey. And so you could imagine him going on the door and saying, my name's Chauncey Hare, I'm going to take a photograph, and this photograph will be deposited in the Library of Congress as a way to document the way Americans lived in the 1970s. I mean, that's what he wanted, and he did contact the Library of Congress, but, And there is one photograph of Hare's in the Library of Congress. I mean, there's so many remarkable facts about Chauncey Hare's life. I would say, don't start me talking about Chauncey Hare. There are only 5 photographs of Chauncey Hare in public collections. 1 at the Library of Congress and 4 at MoMA. We can talk more about the 4 at MoMA, hopefully in a second. And as far as I know, no one who taught him or was friends with him owns any. There aren't any private collections, as far as I know. And maybe the other thing to say is Hare, in 1999, he died in 2019. In 1999, he donated all of his negatives, all of his prints, all of his papers to the Bancroft Library at the University of California, intentionally not the Berkeley Art Museum, because he didn't want his work to be understood as art, with the provision that the caption about multinational corporations must appear anytime the work is reproduced, and that the prints can never be shown. You can make exhibition prints, and you can reproduce them in ink, but you cannot show his prints that he made. So there's no market. There'll never be a market for these works. And so the question of if you can ever even have an exhibition of this work is another question. Anyhow, let's get to the photographs that you were talking about. In 1976, on his 3rd Guggenheim, he begins photographing his fellow workers at Standard Oil. And these maybe are the more anti-humanist photographs, although I see, again, a kind of pathos in at least the
well,
image
that's what I was
of the
going
work.
to say.
It depends on who.
The hierarchy of status.
Yes.
And also what I don't have any photos of, he took a lot of photos of African American line workers, none of whom, well, there's one photo of a desk job guy, but none of the photos are of anyone in the admin. And his photos of the admin are deeply alienated and sort of evidentiary. And the humanism shows up in his relationship to people who live in desperately poor circumstances and miserable homes and who are often mistreated by the corporation. So
Yes, this is this moment of politicization,
Yes.
I think, where he kind of moves from humanism to anti-humanism, if you want to even use those terms, or sentimental to something much cooler and critical.
of the upper management.
Yes, yeah. Which is, I think, I would say 70% of Standard Oil photographs are upper management. So Martha sent me a bunch of photographs yesterday, and some of them I've never seen before,
Well, that I didn't.
which is really interesting. But maybe just, so this is a nice comparison.
Yeah.
This is the one on the right, is talk about people in cages, right?
So great.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe we'll just go through a few if you see. Yeah, I mean, he was probably the first great poet of the cubicle. Right? And this is 1975, 74.
I like that you quote Nikhil Saval.
Yeah, that's a great book if you haven't read it. Nikhil Saval's Cube, The History of the Cubicle.
He's a state representative in Pennsylvania.
That's right.
Now, member of DSA.
And I mean, maybe the other thing that's so remarkable, I mean, there is a kind of humor in some of these photographs, often through kind of ironic juxtapositions, right? If you're going to say something.
Well, I will say that because of his inescapable misogyny, women are always victims and often portrayed as shrunken by the
Withered.
yeah. Though I did hear the BBC, and I think it was in the Times also, that, they discovered that seatbelt technology was developed around men, which means there are 47% more fatalities among women. Oh, who knew? Yeah, so we see that this is not an environment friendly to women, but he always portrayed himself as a friend of women, which was
Little problem. We can get into that as well. I mean,
and see I guess there's a picture of a cheetah on the
yes,
wall.
again, yeah.
Yeah, and an outdoors thing that the forest there, and it says word processing or word processing center.
Yeah.
And there's a woman out the door, as we would agree, he's very, very careful about what is within the frame when he can be.
Yes, and I think exactly, I mean, he has an incredibly well-developed eye for these kind of ironic juxtapositions, which invest the photograph with significance.
But the counterpoint between these two is, of course, he's positioned her in a corner. If you wanna, if you wanna make people look small and ridiculous, make sure they're in a corner. And here, she's in a corner, though it's the reverse corner.
Although, I mean, I would say that that is a strategy that he's already using in images like this, where he has the whole family cornered.
Yeah.
Right? It's something that
But I mean, in
transcends.
terms of the geometry of the office,
Yes.
he's very careful about where, you know, what are the angles, who sits where, what goes out the door, and so on in terms of visuality. I mean, this is the man with the gauges. He's has this almost startled look and his hard hat, but then everything, it's like it's very far away, but it fills up his entire day. And of course it wraps around. And again, I mean, you position these very nicely because you have again the reverse cage here and the difference between management and the workers in the technical field.
I mean, I think this also gives you a sense
Yeah.
that he really is, I think, putting more attention into
take
the
it
offices.
back.
Oh, you wanna go back?
Yeah, because
Okay.
of the desk worker and the housekeeper.
Yes.
And one is static and the other's in motion, but I mean, this is like screaming about status.
Mhm.
This is poor schmuck.
And maybe it's worth saying that Standard Oil initially gives him all full access. But that lasts about.
Working for them.
Well,
He was an employee.
he was an employee, but I think he also was very, I mean, one of the great joys of working on this book was that he was a great paper worker, and he wrote lots of memos and he kept lots of memos. You can see the correspondence between him and the Standard Oil higher ups. And he's selling I'm going to do this project, and I'm going to make a book, and it's going to be something to help Standard Oil's public. Right? He's trying to sell it, and I think pretty soon they realize that this is not the kind of book that they want shown, and so they stop the deal. They stop it, and it's even more complicated. He invited a vice president of Standard Oil to go on public radio and talk with Charles Reich, his countercultural, the greening of America, right? And so it was a setup. It was a total setup, and they realized that Chauncey had their number, and so they closed off his access. And this is that precise moment when he is in negotiations with his exhibition with John Sarkowski for a short moment. And Sarkowski chooses not to include any of the Standard Oil work. And the question is it an aesthetic decision? Because Sarkowski has a kind of refined eye, and he sees these works as less purely photographic? Or, as Hare begins to think, is it some kind of conspiracy that the Rockefeller-funded MoMA doesn't want to show critical work of Rockefeller's Standard Oil? And so Hare becomes very disillusioned with MoMA. I don't know, do we want to go to that part of the story already? This is when it gets interesting. If it hasn't already been interesting, we can maybe go back to some of these.
Okay, so that's Crown Zellerbach Plaza, and I remember having a long conversation with him about these poor, mostly women who are so lowly that they even take their lunch under.
Where is that?
Zellerbach Plaza. I don't know what that is anymore.
Somewhere in San
Oh,
Francisco.
it's in San
Oh, I know where it is. Yeah, it's right downtown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
just remember his bitterness toward the guys with their butts on the railing and these poor little office workers he was the champion of. But it's a great photo.
I mean, I'm not saying that Sarkowski was right not to include them. But this really
What a
made Hare.
shock.
Yeah, this made Hare very angry.
The tree, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, my favorite pairing is this one, and I talked about this. And these are actually juxtaposed on a page. So Hare published 2 books on his own. In 1978, he published a book called Interior America that was published by Aperture. That was more or less a catalog to the MoMA show.
So you would bring it on.
No,
I left mine.
yeah, you have to imagine.
It's a coffee table.
Yeah, it's a very nice book, and I think, it got,
Nice, tasteful cover
and it was well received. It was reviewed
Yes.
in the New Yorker.
Very respectful.
Yeah, it was, Janet Malcolm wrote an incredible essay about
which
it.
I didn't know about until I read it.
It's a great piece of writing, and the title is amazing, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And then he self-publishes a second book in 1984 called This Was Corporate America. And this is a spread, we created a spread from that book, where you have, as you can see, this office work. I love this combination. This guy staring at a computer, again, in 1974, 75, a very early instance of a computer in an office. And then these bankers' boxes. Like, whose office? Who wants to work there? It's like your office becomes storage, auxiliary storage. And then the great detail, and you can see this coat hanger with a pair of shears hanging from one of the hooks. I mean, it's kind of from a calm little detail. What's that? And then on the other side, you have all these more, like these banker boxes have just reproduced like rabbits, and they're all over the place. And then you see the same or a similar coat hanger, coat rack, now with a coat hanger on it. And then these kind of Christmas wreaths being held in storage. And maybe you can notice this one figure in the phones. Janet Malcolm notes this, that one of Hare's great gifts is power cords. The kind of unseemly cords that just exist in all of our houses. And he's such a poet of these cords. But you also have this figure, right, who's kind of blurred again. Maybe it's like the figure you saw before. And putting these two, and even the same chair, right? This rolling desk chair reappears.
Every office had those chairs.
Right, but I think by putting these two photographs next to one another, it's like this guy becomes, it's the disappearance of him.
Except he's a guy with a jacket.
Right.
So I'm not so sure.
Martha, can you hold the mic?
Oh, I was just saying he's management. I mean, he's lower level PMC. Whereas I'm not so sure about that guy.
Or I would argue that guy who's blurred is somehow responsible for this guy's, firing or something. I don't know.
Maybe the same guy.
It's the same guy? I don't know.
Probably not.
There's something forlorn about those Christmas tree ornaments.
Yeah.
It suggests that this is not a happy story. Somebody didn't get their bonus. Oh, so here's Interior America, the cover with the photograph of Orville. This is a different copy. They all look the same. Yours has.
Because mine has the Barnes and Noble.
I noticed yours had the price tag for $6.95.
From Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, it was.
You've heard of Barnes and Noble?
Yeah, not in this building.
Yeah. Well, that's why I sent you that.
So maybe we can. This is where you enter the story, right? So Hare. Hare, after receiving his third Guggenheim and a MoMA show, decides to quit his job at the age of 46 after 20 years at Standard Oil and enroll at the San Francisco Art Institute, where we could see him with his classmates on the roof of the Art Institute. I think this was for their thesis show in 1978, and this is where you met Chauncey as a visiting professor, right?
Yeah, I was co-teaching with Sakula at the Art Institute. As you point out in the book, though, his stance is as distant from everybody else as he could make it, including the way his body is turned. But you did something that I guess I thought it was really odd. In talking, first of all, I had no idea he was 46 years old. I mean, like what? Because nobody had any idea how old anybody was, and you spent pages talking about how old the people in the faculty were.
Well,
in order
it's
to make your
important.
point.
It's important. I wasn't just doing it because Hare, as you know, was assigned when he came into. And I don't have the image, but it's in the book of his application, which is remarkable, where he just writes one sentence: "I need a degree in order to teach." That's what he said on his application. And then he said, "I have a show coming up at MoMA, and if you want to look at my prints, you'll have to insure them because they're so expensive." Can you imagine? It's remarkable. I mean, the Hare ephemera is so great. But he was supposed to be Hank Wessel's
Yeah.
advisee, who was a pretty established, I mean, not particularly old,
But
but
was he 46 years old?
I think we know that.
Yeah, I
Yes,
know.
but what's interesting, but what I think the point is that so many of the faculty were very young at this time, including you and Ray and Louie, everyone else. And so Hare is much older than most of his professors, and he seems to choose the younger people
Like
to be
Reagan.
like Reagan, who's 26.
I had no idea till I read your book that Reagan was like in his 20s.
Yeah, he was 1 year out of grad school.
Yeah, I guess I knew that, but so
Yeah.
you could be 46 and you.
Yeah. And then Reagan almost becomes Chauncey's disciple.
Right.
And so there's a kind of guru complex going on.
A fine photographer.
Oh, and he would be the first one to admit that he was under his spell for a moment.
But Reagan was a fine
Oh,
photographer.
yeah, yeah.
He was an excellent.
He still is.
Yes. I just want to say,
Yeah.
no,
Oh.
it's not that.
You can be under Chauncey's spell and still be a fine photographer. I think two things are not mutually exclusive. But I don't know if you want to.
No,
Oh, Connie,
yes,
I see that.
smack
Oh, yeah.
in the middle.
I mean, one of the great joys, and this was really a pandemic project, and one of the great joys, and again, I'd never written a biography before, and I'd never really done an oral history before, but it was fun to reach out to, found this postcard in his archives at Berkeley, and of course the names are all on the back, so I started Googling the names. And I found a lot of these people, many of them who are still practicing photographers in one way or
I
another.
don't remember their names, but I certainly remember that we always met up on that upper deck. And I mean, you know, it's like the whole thing is like art brut. It was like really horrible. But the gallery was right around the corner from where we were. But it was, you know, windy and stuff. And like generally, when you sit up on the roof deck, everything feels provisional. So the cafeteria was right there also, so it's always like we sat and we talked, but everybody was always sort of moving somewhere else or getting out of the wind or whatever. But it definitely was a cohesive kind of group and lively and so on. But as we know, he was cantankerous.
Everyone recalls that during crits, he would kind of sit in the corner and not contribute, you know, and he was a, you know, I mean, and people thought it was really weird that this guy who had a MoMA show was getting an MFA, you know, what was that about?
Particularly that.
Yeah, I mean, but I think, I mean, this gets to the PMC, professional management class, you know, that Hare couldn't, I mean, this I think is part of his tragedy, is that he wanted to be an artist, but he couldn't imagine him being an artist without the right professional credentials. So he needed the MFA because he needed to teach, which of course is also just a function of being an artist, right? You need a job, most artists
Right.
need jobs.
But that's the excuse we all had for going to graduate
Right,
school.
right, absolutely, but you all didn't have MoMA shows.
No, none of us.
Or an aperture monograph, or 3 Guggenheims, right? I mean, that was the shocking thing, to have those credentials and then go to art school. He ultimately can't get a job. Can you imagine why, Martha?
Yes, when you're aggressive and paranoid.
Well, I mean, maybe, I don't know how much, I can't remember if we talked about this when I interviewed you for the book, but during this period, he was primarily working on a series of photographs of the BART riders. He was photographing people riding the subways in San Francisco and sex workers, which he has, how do you describe it? He won't let anyone see these prints until 2050 because of what he calls the shaming content of them. Yes.
Meanwhile, this was
Use the microphone.
the site of the prostitutes union and Coyote. This was-
Coyote, that's right,
Coyote.
exactly.
She just died, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting her name. I mean, this was a very prominent element in San Francisco, and I didn't know that I don't remember this, I don't think I knew about it.
Okay, some of the other
Yeah.
students talked about how he would kind of almost brag about it as a way
Well,
to,
like,
yeah.
So, I do want to point out that we actually had a relationship of friendship and you know, I edited whatever, the intro to one.
This was corporate America.
Yeah, I guess so, because that's where he talks about Victor.
And that's where he says some people, I think, I was thinking about this after you told me that he writes the introduction. Some people told me I shouldn't include this stuff because it's too raw.
He said that his child was unwanted. I mean, it was a little child. I said, he's gonna grow up and read this. Really, you don't have to do.
Well, he had no filter and kind of had this naive faith in authenticity.
Well, yeah, that's the other thing actually that you talk about, and of course the whole question of authenticity in relationship to the photographic image and everything else. I even went back and checked my own book on culture class. Didn't I write a whole section? Yeah, because we are, if nothing else, our culture is dominated by demands of authenticity, which we don't actually need. But sincerity and authenticity are always, and also, Adorno? Come on. Adorno wrote a book about authenticity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not a new subject. I mean, it's always an element of the American character because it supposedly is related to the question of democracy and common people and the little man and so on. But it also is related to questions of theatricality and the movie industry and every other walk of life. I mean, and of whom do we demand sincerity and authenticity? Not of politicians, for example, though, of course, it does thread through in some way. But yes, authenticity.
And so I think one of the fascinating paradoxes of Hare is that he seems so committed to this idea of authenticity, and yet so much of his work is predicated on a certain duplicity.
Yes.
Right? And moreover,
Or as
like,
I said, he's a liar.
yeah, as the self-portrait is entirely posed, and I mean, he would be. There's no way he could have taken this without posing it, and there's. It's like a still life with his little trusty dictaphone there. It's all, and then the most wonderful detail is the poster that says, "What's bugging you?" Which is more or less over his head. I mean, this is all to say it's artifice, which is not to say it's a bad. In some ways, it makes it a more interesting photograph, but it certainly isn't authentic.
Yeah, so at some point we should talk about discourse of the 60s and harvest. Oh, we should talk about the discourses of the 60s. I would say what I think you didn't mention is Irving Goffman and the whole notion of life as a performance and self-presentation and the relationship between photography, authenticity, and performance, which to me is what Arbus's work is about, and rarely acknowledged to be so because then it's not sincere.
Yes, I mean, I was thinking about that. I mean, I think for Hare, I never cites Goffman. For him, it's someone like Carlos Castaneda, this renegade anthropologist.
That's the 70s.
Well, 68 is when the Teachings of Don Juan comes out, and this idea of having a kind of.
I love that book.
Everyone loved that book. I know, it was very popular.
Not you. You didn't live.
I tried to read it. I couldn't
I
read it.
did, I was in California.
But that idea of kind of having a kind of persona. Because I think that becomes very important for Hare, this idea of almost having a kind of magical persona. Let's just finish the story, I know. So, Hare can't get a job, but at the same time, Fred Landier's student. Yes, this is Chauncey. So he gets very mad at MoMA, tries to get MoMA to give him back the 4 photographs that they've purchased. They didn't do that. He's included in a 1978 show called Mirrors and Windows, which is a kind of survey of sorts of post-war photography that Sarkowski curated.
It's a paradigm-dominating statement about what is or isn't photography worth looking at.
And Hare wants his photograph not included in the catalog, and when the show comes to San Francisco, he pickets it, the opening where Sarkowski's lecturing, and hands out this awareness guide that he types up, which it's funny, but he's also quite, I used to work prescient, and Martha said maybe that's not the right word, but he's at once criticizing the fact that his work is being misrepresented by being depoliticized, and the political content is being downplayed, but also he's criticizing the fact that Philip Morris is a corporate sponsor of this exhibition, one of the first major corporate sponsor shows. And so again, there's something quite virtuous about this, but it's always mixed up with his own narcissism, right? This is part of the tragedy of Hare. But these great photographs of Hare handing out the awareness guide in front of. And then he also, so here's, maybe if you want to talk about Arbus and performativity, we can look at this Arbus that's on the cover of the catalog to Mirrors and Windows, which is, I mean, I talk a little bit about this photograph in the book, in the fact that, you know, this is a photograph of a man ostensibly watching a parade on Fifth Avenue, taking off his hat, perhaps because a float with a flag, putting it over his heart, right? But he's also doing it in front of Arbus, right? So there's this
With a
kind of,
big camera.
with a view camera, or not a view camera, a Rolleiflex, yeah. Well, it's something like that. It's
Oh.
Mamiya, that's correct. Yeah, that's what she is. But yeah, enough that somehow his gesture is much towards Arbus as it is towards the parade. And anyhow, I don't know if you want to say more about Arbus in terms of what you were saying before.
You know, the idea of what is your relationship to the subject, I think. I would say that one thing we can certainly say about Chauncey is that he was very attached to Orville. He moved into the house along with Connie and a number of other people.
I have a photograph of that if you want to see it.
Sure. And he cared deeply about the way that the underlings, the labor force, I guess you can say the blue collar force was treated. And I think it's very difficult to see. And Arbus, who comes from an entirely different milieu, a different class, a different background, and a different formative moment, how she stands in relationship to our subjects, though people are constantly trying to assert that she has some deep identification with them. I would say they're both narcissists, well, probably most photographers who deal with human subjects are narcissistic. Maybe we're all narcissists.
Well, I think both Arbus and Hare would at certain moments say that their portraits of other people are always, to a certain degree, self-portraits.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yes, I think that's right.
That they read the world in terms of their own reading of themselves.
Yes.
I think Arbus, it's actually a very strong thing to say about her, but it's always what is being denied, that it's not a projection. It's actually a representation and an allyship or identification, none of which I believe. So soon.
But we don't have to go down that road.
Well,
but this is, again, one of the most remarkable discoveries during my research.
is,
This catalog.
Oh.
Well, you want to say something more about Arbus? Okay. So while I was at MoMA to look at their 4 prints of Hare's, the curator, Sarah Meister, said, you know, I think we have something else you might want to see. And she said, when Hare was very angry at Sarkowski during the Mirrors and Windows escapade, he mailed a defaced copy of the catalog to the photo department, which we don't have. It's in the study collection. I mean, it just brings this thing out. You know, it's not
there anymore.
No, since my book came out, they've now cataloged it. It's
No,
now.
she's not there.
She's not there either.
Yeah,
that's right. But it's now an object d'art in the collection, right? Which it should be, because it is a great piece of photo
There's
collage.
your central story, emasculation.
Yes, right. I mean, what do you do with that? So he sees the depoliticization of his photographs as a form of emasculation. Exactly. And this is this book that he mails to Sarkowski, cutting off the Arbus photograph, and then pasting on each subsequent page the awareness guide. So instead of the photographs, you have the awareness guide. And then you get to the middle part where his photograph would be, and he has taped the Arbus photograph over his photograph. You can see he kind of drilled a hole through it where the man's hat is. He's kind of taking this violent drill bit, and then you can see on the left this picture of Orville. Congratulations on the good work, all your friends at MoMA shafted again. And then you can see it says lift, and there's also, I mean, this is a remarkable piece of photo collage The little note that he got for an invitation to the opening of Mirrors and Windows, it's a handout to Hare. So you lift up the picture, and there you see the photograph that's included in the exhibition, which he considers his most aesthetic, least political photograph.
Yes.
And this is Sarkowski, there's Burden and Blula, these are members of the trustees, answer petition, right, which is the petition for his photographs to be returned to him. What's my next option? I mean, Susan Kismerick, who was the curatorial assistant who I spoke to, said, she's the one who opened this envelope. And it was like getting something from terrorists. And they were worried that this guy was going to be outside on 53rd Street waiting for Sarkowski to come out the door. And it was a truly violent kind of object in some ways.
Shark, bird, bull. He has these animal puns
Yes, well,
based on names.
yes,
So I don't know who bull is, but
Arthur
Bird.
Gould,
Oh.
Shirley Burden, who was a photograph
right.
photographer himself.
She,
Yeah.
well, I'm Burden.
Shirley Burden, who's actually a man, who was himself a kind of,
He funded
Trustee.
Aperture.
What?
He funded Aperture. He owned the building that Aperture was on.
he was a Vanderbilt.
Yeah, that's what I say. He's a
When you're a
rich
Vanderbilt,
donor.
yeah,
Yeah.
but a photographer as well. Not, I mean, he has works in the MoMA collection. And so, maybe just to get to the end of this story, obviously this does not bode well for Hare's career. He had another show in the works at the San Francisco Museum of Art that was going to be a kind of group show with Bill Owens and Joanne Leonard, who has a great body of work up right now at MoMA. It's an artist who I didn't know about until I did this work, and it's some remarkable work that's interesting because it was actually prompted by Hare's instigation, the series that she does of kitchen interiors in the 60s. But that show hits the rails because Hare is impossible.
Well, he was very angry about also the refusal to include these captions that he wanted that explained this.
But he also gets to the point where he says he doesn't want his work included with Leonard's and Owens because he feels that he's doing so, they're on a different trip than he is.
Right, but
That's what he says.
he didn't say that to me.
No.
He was talking about the inclusion of, he was really exercised over their refusal to include his political intentions in those catalogs talking about exploitation.
Yes, but if you look at the paperwork, the curator John Humphreys seems totally supportive of the political aspects. There's a little bit.
I didn't know that till I read
Yeah,
that.
well,
because
that's not the story he presents in his long introductions to his 3 books. This is one of the other fascinating thing about Hare is that he presents one story, but when you start to look at the archival record, it's a little more complicated than what he presents.
That's why I said he was a liar.
But because he has to go back to the workforce where he works at the EPA for a few years, and gets fired from that job for kind of trying to make workplace conditions better, ostensibly is what he says.
Insubordination, I think.
That's what they say, yes. But at the same time, self-publishes a book called This Was Corporate America.
So this must be what I edited right there.
Yes, yeah. And this did come out with a small show at the Berkeley Museum of Art, which traveled to the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston.
Because of David Ross.
That's right, who found out about Chauncey. David Ross told me when I interviewed him, he found out about Hare because Richard Serra had a copy of Interior America and said, this is the good stuff.
Wow.
It's kind of a remarkable fact. Yes, so David Ross who was at Berkeley and then goes to Boston, brings the show there. And Hare publishes this book, doesn't really get much attention, unlike Interior America. By now he's kind of...
It's kind of an ugly book.
Well, I interviewed the person who was the printer, and this was, he uses a print shop in Oakland that only printed corporate, what do they call it, annual reports. You know, he kind of either, I think what the printer said was he intentionally wanted an ugly book to not be aestheticized. Yeah, they're not beautiful reproductions at all.
The cover is horrible.
The cover's crazy. You can't really even make out what's going on in this cover, which is this picture of Hare releasing his father.
Yeah, but you don't know that.
You don't know, well, if you read the story, you do. And then you can kind of make out this line drawing that the woman who actually printed it made of a
I sent you that.
yeah, I have it, yeah.
He must have had it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Of a man jumping out of a window, which he said he saw. So it was kind of an early form of going postal, right? A form of workplace violence.
No.
Well, no, he wasn't violent against
Okay.
other people, but
Right.
there was workplace violence against himself. I would say it was an early form of.
I think your book says that that was the headline, no? Or someone wrote about it.
Yeah, there was so there was a photograph in the San Francisco Bay Examiner of this man jumping out of a window. They wouldn't allow him to reproduce the photograph, so he hired someone to do a line drawing of it. And that's what appears on the cover. And I can probably find, I have to show two of my favorite pictures of Hare when he gets into his New Age spiritualism. Maybe, I can find
Sorry.
There we go. Yeah, so there's, this is the frontispiece where he kind of aligns his picture of losing his father with this man jumping out of the window.
Also a horrible drawing.
Well, that's true. Anyhow, this book doesn't get much attention. He gets fired from the EPA, ultimately gets a MA in clinical psychotherapy, where he studies the work abuse, and he kind of publishes his third book called Work Abuse with his second wife, Judy Wyatt, How to Recognize It and Survive It, and becomes a psychotherapist until the end of his life, and was at the kind of forefront of teletherapy, doing email therapy in the 90s.
I've had some correspondence with him at this point, and he was so defended, it was like armor plate with all this jargon of what.
Well, the book is filled with that kind of jargon, yes. Yeah. It's not an easy read, as I say in the first sentence of the book.
Also hideous looking.
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned this, but of course, if you just take away the word work, I mean the word work, it's child abuse.
Well,
That's his whole story.
he says that in the book, that in fact people should read, I said everyone should read Work Abuse, first of all. I think it's an excellent book. I mean it.
I believe you.
I've used it in my own professional life. But he says that in the book, and I quoted in my book that people who are abused as children often become abusive bosses, and that there's this kind of cycle where abuse that occurs in the domestic realm. And anyone who's ever worked in an office knows, there's some truth to this, right? That you do see the kind of child in your coworkers at certain moments when they become jealous or when they become petty. There's the same kind of bullshit you dealt with growing up still exists in the adult realm of the workplace.
Well, it's authoritarianism.
Broken my heart.
It's authoritarianism.
That's right. And one of the most remarkable interviews I had were with some of the people that Hare actually worked with as a therapist who spoke with me. And these were all people who worked in the corporate world, bankers, and as someone who spent my whole life in the nonprofit realm of academia and museums, you realize that these places are like, they're military. They're strongly hierarchical, and they really do describe a kind of workplace that is very different than, when I talk about, dealing with coworkers' jealousy or petty gripes, these people were talking about really cruel work situations. Why are you looking at me like that, Martha?
It's dawning on me that you never had a real job.
I think that means one. That's not true. I did. When I was in high school, I cleaned apartments. I learned a lot about life during those 2 years, I can tell you. Maybe we should, how are we doing on time?
Show more pictures.
Yeah, let's
Show more pictures? Okay. The good stuff, right? You want to see, I brought, I don't know if you want to talk about any of those? Or,
Well, just because,
tell me what you want.
so obviously these are Russell Lee photographs.
Yeah.
And You had mentioned them, but being myself narcissistic, I want to say that these are ones that I always showed in talking about the FSA and about Russell Lee in particular and the idea of staging. And of course, he has photos that you mentioned it. I was hoping you would show his counterparts to these.
The Hare's counterparts
Yeah.
to these, yeah, I think I do. I think I have that way down at the end of the line.
It's funny.
Yes, Connie.
I hope I did. Well, there's no.
Well, we don't have to talk about
Yeah,
it.
maybe I didn't actually.
That was Bill Owens.
Yeah, I know. No, okay. I guess I don't, but he does.
He shares it.
Yeah. I took those out. I'm sorry.
Took what out?
The picture, the
Oh.
Russell Lee photograph. Although this is another incredible find. I discovered just in the last weeks while I was writing my book that there's a copy of Interior America at the University of Texas Library, not in the special collections, but just in the circulating library, that has Hare's inscription to Russell Lee. So he sent Russell Lee a copy with these inscriptions, and then Russell Lee gave his papers to the University of Texas. They put all the correspondence in the special collections. They just thought this was one of his books, put it in the library, and just through the lucky chance of another friend of mine saying, you should look at Alex Soth's Instagram feed because he's showing pictures of this. And then I found this copy.
Wow.
And then, as you know,
should read it.
yeah. So this is a little bit of a what do they call it?
Projection.
No, when you don't want to tell the end of a movie.
Oh,
A
I'm
spoiler
sorry.
spoiler
Spoiler,
alert.
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
Right.
So don't.
No, it's all right. It's not that big a spoiler. He says that he's pointing to this young, the boy in the center, almost dead center of this photograph. There's a boy running down the street. And he writes, "That's me in my mind's eye, flying down the street, putting on my coat in 1940, age 6, on the way to school, across the railway tracks, etc." Right? And this gets to kind of the ultimate point that I make in the book, that Hare's always photographing himself. And even work abuse is filled with anonymous kind of case studies where people describe their own experiences, and they're more or less all Hare. You know? So even that's kind of veiled autobiography. So,
Donald Trump does this.
Yes.
yeah, well, at least Hare wrote it himself.
Well, I meant he used to call their radio stations and pretend to be somebody else and give fake testimony. Yeah.
Well, apparently William James did it too, in his writings of religious experience. So there's a good version
He
for
didn't
it.
call radio stations.
But maybe I'm worried about time.
Yeah, I think we should audience questions at this point now. If
We
you wanna have-
maybe we can use the pictures to answer the questions.
Did he know Jim Goldberg?
Oh,
Yeah.
Keep that one forever.
Oh, so the question was if Hare knew Jim Goldberg, who's a photographer in the Bay Area. They
They
did.
were around at the same time.
Yeah, I interviewed Jim, and he said he had very minimal interaction. The thing about Hare is, it was hard to get to know him. There really were only like 2 or 3 people who knew him well. I think he was a pretty
some
high-strung
people
guy.
have an attractive force. He had a repulsive force.
Yeah. So a lot of Bay Area photographers knew him, and even there were certain photographers who would say, "Oh, I would bump into him in the '90s," and he was still talking about photography, even though he seemed to have disowned it. I think he always kind of carried the flame. He was always looking for that one sincere photographer that you couldn't find in the art world. But yeah, yes and no, and that's probably true of almost any Bay Area photographer.
Question.
No.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you mentioned that you spoke with his clients as a psychotherapist, I'm wondering if the accounts that you got from people who knew him, for example, from the art world, if they differed strongly from those accounts, or how would you characterize that? Because you mentioned, Martha, also that he was very guarded at the point at which you knew him in his period as a psychotherapist. So I'm just wondering what that work changed, like that's his 3rd or 4th career change, but like what that work did to him and how other people experienced that, if you got a sense of that.
I mean, my sense is that the people who he worked with admired him deeply and thought he was really great. And it seems like there's people who either kind of loved Hare and bought into it, and everyone else. And the first group is a minority. But those who, I think the more interesting question is, did he find some kind of peace at the end of his life?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard to say because ultimately he kind of, in the Berkeley papers, he has these series of autobiographical statements. And in one that he writes in '99 when he donates his papers, he more or less says he's in bad health because of all of the antidepressants he has to take in order just to function. And people said in the last years of his life he wouldn't even leave his house. So I mean, he was sick.
Still, what about Judy?
What about it?
What was her?
Yeah, I mean,
They seemed very happy, and I interviewed his second wife, and
so what does it mean to say her husband couldn't leave the house?
I think he was both. I guess he found some kind of peace, but within his own neurotic limits in some ways. Yeah, I mean, she paints a very happy picture of the two of them together, and I think so. Yes, he found peace, but I think he was still a very anxious, difficult person. And maybe one way to say it is that he finally found a way to have control over his work by working at home, working on email. You know, that in some ways it was about finding some kind of the epigraph to Interior America is for those who
Are awakening
to their own authority, right? Which I think is such a, because it kind of bleeds into authoritarianism, right? What does it mean to awaken to your own authority in some ways?
I also need to point out that the defensiveness he was exhibiting toward me was because my conversation I was having with him was about photography, his photography, and he basically denied he'd ever done photography. You know, it was just like, that's not me, I don't do that. But it was long and well-written denials. I saw that as armor, you know, just forget it, you're talking to the wrong person. It was strange. So, because when I knew him as a person when I was working with him and also editing his paper, whatever. So that was, I was startled by his unwillingness to engage at all in a friend. He could have been he could have been friendly and still also said, no, I'm not interested anymore, you know. It was just total lies. That was all I need to say. I mean, he wasn't a man who, he appeared like a person, a complex person, cantankerous, annoying, and so on, but still a person with ideas and concerns, so I don't know.
He was obviously intelligent, and and I mean, but I mean, he was, yeah. I mean, I say that in the sense that there's a sense that he must have been somewhat self-aware. You don't sense that. I mean, I guess my point is, for his intelligence and sensitivity as a photographer, it's remarkable how unself-aware he must have been at times.
Well, I think though what your book makes manifest is the continuity of feeling that his authentic self was hidden by this identity of following, in his father's footsteps in effect. And it's interesting, we're studiously not mentioning Sekula, but I don't know.
We're not studious.
Oh, okay. But, I co-taught with Alan, and of course what was immediately obvious was that what they had to bond over was the Oedipal relationship to their technical fathers, who both worked in sort of death-dealing industries and so on, and the difficulty of being the son of someone whom you rejected or who rejected you, or who you were always looking for favor from, but still had to you had to figure out what you thought of your father and still keep your own integrity. And with Chauncey, it eventually became a series of denunciations because he had these repetitively Oedipal relationships to people like Sharkovsky and other.
That's right. I mean, in Reagan, said that there came a moment where he more or less rejected him and wouldn't speak to him. Yeah, so that's right. It kind of, I mean, I'm sure if I was more well versed in psychoanalysis, we could explain that dynamic. But there's.
It kind of sounds like he was fed up with the art world.
Well, that's one way to put it. I mean, that's part of
But
it.
it's still an extreme response to, I mean, plenty of people get fed up with the art world and or stop making art, but it sounds like fairly extreme.
Yeah, and this was something else because it transcended the art world. It was just.
He also seemed to reject the market, the possibility of the market pretty ruthlessly.
He did, yes.
I mean, and that's a remarkable fact that you.
That's very interesting.
And it's really, I mean, I say I'd love to do an exhibition, but these days it's hard to get an exhibition unless there's a collector base, and there's no collector base and never will be for Hare.
But it was also, I mean, a kind of time, I mean, he might, he's in a way an outlier, but it was a time in which people were very much, and particularly in the Bay Area, trying to do other kinds of, artist galleries or utilize other kinds of spaces, and there was a big critique of the market.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Of galleries and,
But a very specific one, there's Art Workers Coalition at that moment.
Well,
Back in the museum.
That's-
Yes, and my colleague Tom Crow reminded me that even in.
Art Workers Coalition.
Yeah, but that was.
But that was here.
Yeah, but in Richmond, California,
It was.
right in the same
That's right.
neighborhood where Hare
That
is,
was San Francisco.
you have
Yes.
Tom Marioni
Yes,
doing that, and
exactly.
Terry Fox doing
That's
tea
right.
material as well, so you can be
Exactly.
very specific, and that's something I don't include.
and a real
Second
critique
edition.
of the market and of galleries and seeing that,
Well, we should
that there
talk
was a
about
kind of counterculture or trying to create one.
the collective that Connie was in, and when they all lived with Orville.
Right, so that there was a brief moment
Yeah.
where they all lived with Orville, maybe I'm going the wrong way, in his house, Connie, Hatch, Reagan, Louie,
Yeah.
there they are, having ice cream. This is an image that's actually reproduced, this was corporate America, yeah. You can say, there's kind of like a working class fantasy going on here.
There was a lot of that. I mean,
Right,
that
no,
was-
I mean, that's right, and that's not to say that it wasn't
You mean
earnest.
his,
Hare's,
right.
yes.
Let's not talk about Reagan
No,
or
no.
Connie, I would not say
But
that.
it's also the sense in which a potential for an alternative culture persisted in San Francisco after New York was already flat, after
Very much.
Ford told them to drop that. That strength of that counterculture persisted well into the 70s.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was part of that as
I
well,
lived
where,
in San
it's like,
Francisco.
there was
Yeah.
all these institutions, theatrical, critical,
Magical.
And
Outside-
that's where you get
outside
pictures like this, right?
cultural.
Yes.
So that's why I put in Fred Turner's book, because it's the other, it's the other side of, New Age, which is the relationship between the whole Earth catalog and, it says digital utopianism, but we should say libertarian, selfishness and so on. Yeah, that's actually a very nice book.
I know,
Yeah.
Antonella, you had a question?
No, I was just curious. I know Martha said he was a liar, but is there something in his Guggenheim application that we should know? I mean, what is he asking for? Is it 3D applications, same thing?
That is the one piece of evidence I was not able to access during the pandemic. I reached out to the Guggenheim multiple times, and they were never able to give me his application, so I was not able to read his applications. You're showing my Achilles heel as an archival researcher.
Second edition.
I don't
Second.
think that's where he would be telling lies. He might do a little inflation, but I think that what he had to say about what he wanted to do was pretty sincere.
The lies.
And also, I also wanted to say, of course, so obvious, you wrote about this, he bought a van, which he called a cow, and then he talked about living inside the cow. I mean, this poor benighted male, with this father problem, and he's living inside a cow. And of course, all these kitchen pictures are, of course, he's colonizing the feminine, and most of the material with Orville is in Orville's kitchen. I mean, Orville didn't just live in a kitchen.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
It's the same kitchen. And he encouraged kitchen photographs and so on, and sure, why not? But there
And
is
again,
this.
if you remember, there was, what's her name, Bonnie whatever, who did the farm.
Bonnie
Sher.
Sher,
Yeah,
but,
so, but this idea of, again,
and,
in the wind, particularly in Northern California,
sure.
but this the cow, the farm, the grass, in a place that's very
But he wasn't interested in any of that.
But he could, evoke it, but not really be interested in it. It seems like.
The real lies, or
artifact-
the real artifice is in the introductions that he writes to his 3 books, which are each about 25 pages. He writes a lot, and
Can
they're
you
very
say-
autobiographical, and there are a lot of, I would say, critical fabulations, as we would say. Right?
Can you do one more question maybe,
Okay,
and
yeah,
then kind of
yeah.
wrap up? I know, I'm sorry.
You guys, like I said, don't start talking about Chauncey Hare.
I have a question. Did he really have to go back to school to teach? Because I know a lot of great artists just have a high school diploma.
At that time, I think it was almost impossible to get a job teaching art without a credential. And it certainly would have opened a pathway. But you also learn a language when you're in grad school, a form of address. Maybe he had burned his bridges with Tchaikovsky and other people, so they weren't going to be writing letters or hire this guy, he's great, because he'd already shown his fangs and his anti-establishment biases. So I think it's a good question though.
But I mean, the fact is, all of his professors at the Art Institute had MFAs, so that suggests
That's
that.
a new thing that everyone has an MFA.
Yeah, and there's a wonderful book by Howard Singerman called Art Subjects about the rise of the MFA.
It was
and
that moment.
That's
right,
the moment.
the movement
people
from
started
Bohemia to kind of professional management class credentials. It's really, this is that one.
People said it was like having a union card. You can't be a steel worker unless you have a union card, and the same thing happened with teaching.
Right.
And the MFA was like the union card.
And other faculty members would be very resentful if you tried to get on board. I mean, Dee had to get permission in
Yes.
San Diego.
Yes, and many people did then go back. I mean, that's, still, places like Bard, and, summer programs in order to get their credentials together.
Not to
But
mention
it
all
was
the
a
art
moment.
critics who got their PhDs in their
Yeah,
40s
now-
under Rosalind Krauss.
Or now PhDs in Europe, which are really easy. But you can practically buy them. But it was an interesting moment, again, because you're right, certain people could get, like, what's his name? Filmmaker, the brothers. Kuchar could get a job at
He was teaching there.
at the Art Institute without a degree, but again, he was
that's
famous
film.
enough. Oh,
Film
maybe
was really
so.
different. That was the home of the crazies.
But in photography, it's like
Yeah, but it really
John
did
Gossage,
change.
Tom Roma, like these guys are just.
But it really changed, and particularly the people who got jobs without degrees were men. Also,
Yeah.
I mean, on top of that.
Well,
I mean,
Chauncey
you
was a
know,
man identified.
I know he was, but nonetheless, he wasn't famous enough. He would have to get a degree. He obviously couldn't get a job anyway. But no, he couldn't anyway. But it was very exceptional at that point, and it was a real move at that point to really have to have.
Also,
Yeah, could be a superstar.
but
Yeah, late 70s.
if I may, and I hope you agree, he was totally dominated by institutions. He couldn't think beyond institutions. So there was institution, and then there was the void, or maybe the inner world, which is where he eventually moved, but he set up a highly professionalized practice. So he wasn't a hustler in that sense. He couldn't imagine making a living. Maybe that's why he worked with sex workers. They were, institutionalized in some way, but also self-actualized as professionals. I think this was always a quest that he had of how to make it without always bowing down to the institution as father and the father in the institution.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's the tragedy of his life in some ways, is that he wants to be an artist, but he can't imagine being an artist outside of an institution. Yeah.
I think we can.
Can I just, before we close, I want to just say, your copy of my book warms my heart. I just hope anyone who reads a book of mine does this. It's the best thing I've seen all week. It's made a very tough week much better. I also just want to thank you for coming and talking about it.